Today I want to talk about the Marxist war on awareness. Let me begin by unpacking what I'm referring to by citing the work of James Lindsay, an independent academic who has produced an immense amount of empirical evidence proving that CRT, queer theory, gender ideology, intersectionalism, and the unending parade of critical theories being marched out of post-secondary institutions are all neo-Marxist theories. In fact, in his book, The Marxification of Education, Lindsay proves something even more startling, that the saturation of academic institutions with neo-Marxist theories has led to the actual transformation of our public schooling system into Marxist brainwashing centers. Now, this is an important distinction because it is not about teaching children Marxism. It is completely altering their cognition so that all they can see and think about is oppression. Nothing else matters. It goes something like this. While Marx was originally focused on abolishing class, targeting property, and the capitalist bourgeoisie as the evil villain, the fundamental philosophy he was offering was one of rebirth. The working class needed to be reborn to see themselves as oppressed, and they needed to see that this oppression was being constantly reinforced by a bourgeoisie class and the systemic moral pitfalls of capitalism. While this was focused to a great deal on capitalism, what Lindsay lays out so clearly is that the neo-Marxists have taken this notion of class and capitalism and property and replaced them with race, gender, body type, brain damage level, etc., etc. Through the university system's cultivating of an obsession with a Brazilian Marxist named Paulo Freire, post-secondary studies of education has become hyper-focused on creating a new and very Marxist form of consciousness. Freire, who Lindsay shows is one of the most cited theorists in universities today, did literally talk about using education not to teach math, reading, or history, but to alter the consciousness of the students. He actually called the process conscientization. In fact, his form of neo-Marxism proposed that knowledge itself was the system of oppression. Freire presented the idea that children being taught math were simply being indoctrinated into a new system of oppression made up of knowers and not knowers, while being left blind to the horrifying ways they were truly being oppressed. He believed this so passionately that he claimed Easter and the rebirth of Jesus was better used to focus on the rebirth of the oppressed class into the most radical form of neo-Marxist thought out there, that the only way we should see the world is through the identification of oppression and to revolt against the forces doing the oppressing. This Marxist brainwashing was about people dying and being reborn to see the world through the eyes of the oppressed, and these are the ways Freire defined it. This is not an exaggeration on the part of Lindsay or myself. Lindsay lays this case out pretty starkly. Academic institutions have been producing teachers who follow Freire's religion, and it does literally teach that the offering of basic subjects in school is oppressive unless those subjects are radically reframed to kill the child's current consciousness and have it reborn to see math through the eyes of the oppressed, to see history through the eyes of the oppressed, to see geography through the eyes of the oppressed. This is no joke. This is Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy, and as Lindsay points out in his book, it mimics all the techniques of known Chinese communist brainwashing, and it is the passionate religion of a growing majority of public school teachers. As Lindsay points out in Race Marxism, this new form of consciousness is described as what we need to be doing for the rest of our lives, engaging in ongoing self-awareness. This may sound simple enough, except that in the story of death and rebirth at the heart of these neo-Marxist teachings, the self is a two-dimensional being. This new self is both oppressed and at the same time never quite aware enough of how they are also the oppressor. With the addition of intersectionality into the landscape of neo-Marxism, the mind becomes an endless labyrinth, since the classes are suddenly defined by an endless list of identities. To be feminist is to be racist, since it's not black feminism. But to only focus on black feminism is to fat shame, since it does not identify how oppressed someone is if they are black, obese, and a woman. This is, of course, a study that denies neurodiversity, since it doesn't focus on how oppressed someone is if they are black, obese, mentally disabled, and a woman. This is like setting a thermostat so that the programmed temperatures that trigger the air conditioning or the heat are set right next to each other. It is a state of perpetual anxiety, self-shaming, and outrage at the level of victimization not only being perpetrated on the self, but being perpetrated by the self. Those familiar with mindfulness will recognize that this is antithetical to the practice of becoming more mindful. In fact, Alan Watts, one of the most popular teachers, known for bringing the concept of mindfulness from the East into the West, makes this analogy in his book, The Way of Zen. If we try to make a thermostat absolutely accurate, that is, if we bring the upper and lower limits of temperature very close together in an attempt to hold the temperature at a constant 70 degrees, the whole system will break down. For to the extent that the upper and lower limits coincide, the signals for switching off and switching on will coincide. If 70 degrees is both the lower and upper limit, the go sign will also be the stop sign. Yes will imply no, and no will imply yes, whereupon the mechanism will start trembling, going on and off until it shakes itself to pieces. The system is too sensitive and shows symptoms which are startlingly like human anxiety. For when a human being is so self-conscious and so self-controlled that he cannot let go of himself, he dithers or wobbles between opposites. Neo-Marxism and the demands it makes on consciousness are literally designed to take the already anxious Western mind and to crank up the anxiety. It is an absolute attack on mental health and on awareness itself. Think of it this way. Empiricism is the philosophy that our best access to truth is through the body. It is our embodied sense of life itself that delivers us to truth, and the mind is a companion in this process. Many schools of mindfulness look at the benefits of quieting the mind to be able to experience embodiment more deeply. Even if one cannot experience true inner silence, there is still an importance placed upon being able to observe how the mind creates suffering through incessant chattering, criticism of the past, and fears of the future. This was already a struggle for the Western mind, and arguably why so many people in the West took up the Eastern traditions that began to create some sense of relief and empowerment. Add on top of this the fact that screens are increasingly becoming a ritual of disembodiment, and the reality of how dangerous this neo-Marxist consciousness is for our society becomes clear. Because the praxis of neo-Marxism is the constant inner dialogue sustaining endless paranoia about who is more oppressed and how much we're oppressing others. It arguably foments mental illness. So, if you are trying to become more aware in the sense of mindfulness, that is to say, to become more aware of awareness itself as a bedrock for all other experiences of consciousness, then there is nothing more destructive than a practice that demands constant self-doubt, shame, and a sickly hatred for the oppression hidden inside every person, institution, and social norm around you. Marxism eats awareness. It consumes it. It is perhaps one of my major inspirations for this show in that it has become clear to me that there is an attempt to degrade all forms of situational awareness, both in terms of the individual and in terms of the collective. One of the teachings I have come across that enlivens a practical perspective for navigating awareness in the minefield of modern warfare comes from an intuitive empath named Lujan Matthus. In his book, The Power of Emptiness, Matthus identifies the internal process that robs us of situational awareness as a dynamic playing out between the ghost and the thief. In this analogy, the thief is the mind, while the ghost is the emotions. What Matthus describes so clearly is the ways in which we can enter into an emotional state only to have the internal dialogue of the mind insert itself and reinforce what we are feeling away from the moment we are in. Conversely, in this dynamic, the mind can generate an internal monologue that invites the ghost, the emotions, to then build upon this internal dialogue and literally curate an emotional state as another means of robbing us of situational awareness. What I like about this analogy is that it empowers us with a practical tool to see how the mind and the emotions avail us to social engineering. In the Citizen's Guide to Fifth Generation Warfare, we are specifically told that the warfare targeting us is seeking to keep us living within a form of emotionality that stops us from thinking critically. This is one of the core tactics with the psychological operations constantly seeking to influence our cognition. What Matusa's analogy shows us is the inner workings which these psychological operations prey upon. Any study of one of these operations will clearly reveal examples of the ghost and the thief at play. People's minds are either filled with bad info, which later generates an emotional wave, or they are targeted with propaganda that purposefully causes a form of emotional reactivity, which then opens them up to bad information. What's more, this analogy clarifies with perfect specificity the way in which the Neo-Marxist theories dominating our cultural and educational landscape rob us of situational awareness. The pedagogy being enacted in the schools, according to Paulo Freire, is specifically designed to create an emotional response in the student according to the systems of oppression being revealed. This theory, which dominates our public education system according to Lindsay, then preys upon the emotional state generated in the child and seeks to create within them an internal dialogue perpetually focused on class-based oppression. So, while a math lesson may start with a family headed 50 miles to the amusement park and on the surface asks how many miles are left if they have driven 25 miles, the teacher promoting these ideas then shifts the conversation and starts to ask about families who can't afford the amusement park or can't afford a car, or if more white families are going than blacks, and eventually creates an emotionally charged dialogue that opens the student up to a Marxist form of consciousness. Neo-Marxist mathematics. If we are to take Matusa's concept of the ghost and the thief into account, Neo-Marxism leaves people haunted by the rage of the oppressed and robbed by an endless internal dialogue of identity Marxism. This is all, of course, merely an updated version of the color revolution. Communists knew well that using racial tension was the best way to fracture society, and this communist tactic has merely evolved along the lines of fifth-generation warfare. But don't be fooled. People like Klaus Schwab are not Marxists. They see Marxism and communism as merely a tool for social change, exactly like Hitler did. Quote, "Gradually I became an expert in the doctrine of the Marxists and used this knowledge as an instrument to drive home my own firm convictions." As Lindsay points out, in race Marxism, Hitler hated Marxists, and yet he used their theories. So just like we are not really up against leftism, we are not entirely up against communism, but social engineers who have a deep enough understanding of history and behavior to be able to apply communist principles towards their own end. So that one guy who bombs my comments on Instagram, who believes in Marxism, isn't evil. He has real hope. That's not the same as the elites who are using it as a tool by any stretch of the imagination. So my advice? Do the opposite of what the neo-Marxists are proposing. See human potential and vibrant sovereignty in all the people around you. Become aware of your own ghost and your own thief, and do not allow yourself to be daily disembodied, be that from the neo-Marxist influences around you or from the transhumanist influences seeking to disembody us through perpetual overstimulation, technological division, and the rigging of our dopamine system. Become more embodied and build the same legacy for your children. If you are an advocate for free thought like I am, then remember that free thought is a philosophical viewpoint which holds that positions regarding truth should be formed on the basis of logic, reason, and empiricism rather than authority, tradition, revelation, or dogma. Thank you for watching. I'm Simon Esler, and this has been Situational Awareness. and this was my weekly monologue. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, consider supporting my work, including streaming my latest documentary, Cut, Daughters of the West, which you can purchase and stream on demand at daughtersofthewestfilm.com. And don't forget to keep an eye out for the live counterpart to my weekly monologues, where I'll be broadcasting on Rumble and Pilled.net.